This is Professor Stephen Litch in the Principles of Economics, and I'm going to talk about solutions to externality problems. Remember, an externality is some type of behavior that impacts someone else who did not consent to the transaction. The prime example of an externality is pollution. A factory might manufacture widgets, sell them to customers, but in the process, the pollution harms other people. People who are not the producer, people who are not the consumers. Okay. When a good causes a negative externality, the market tends to overproduce the good. So like pollution causes a negative externality, and the market overproduces goods that cause pollution. And when there's a negative externality, the market underproduces the good. Okay, so what are some solutions to this? I'm going to talk about a couple of options for the government and then a handful of options for private individuals. The government solutions really fall into two categories. The government can either manipulate the quantity with some type of control or limit on the amount of the good that can be produced, or it can manipulate the price, essentially by taxing or subsidizing. So, first of all, controls. For a negative externality, the government could put in place a quota or an upper limit on the amount of the good that is produced or consumed. For example, in many cases with pollution, there's an upper limit on the amount of harmful particulates, harmful substances that a factory or a car can produce. So those are examples of quotas, upper limits. When it comes to positive externalities, it's harder for the government to manipulate quantities because it would require that people would have to purchase more of the good than they want or to consume more of the good than they want. The prime example of a positive externality would be a vaccination. When I get vaccinated, it reduces the chance that I get sick. That's my own private benefit. But since I don't get sick, I don't pass the disease on to other people, which is the positive externality. If we simply let people make decisions on their own about whether to vaccinate, some people might decide that the private benefit is not worth the cost of the vaccination. But they are leaving out the public benefit or the social benefit or the positive externality from the vaccination. So ideally, we would want to force people to get vaccinated if the social benefit is more than the cost. But all that people care about is the private benefit. Okay, as I said, the government often has few options to require people to purchase or consume something that causes a positive externality. The government might link something desirable to the activity causing the positive externality, or, for example, getting vaccinated is a requirement for attending public school. Okay, so there's a way of getting people to do something even when they might feel that the private benefit does not justify the cost. Maybe another example is paying a tax for a public good. Everyone is forced to, for example, contribute to fire protection through paying taxes. The other option is for the government to manipulate the price either with a tax or a subsidy. Goods that cause negative externality, the government would want to tax them, which will effectively reduce the quantity that people want to purchase. The government would want to subsidize anything causing a positive externality as a way of encouraging people to purchase it. Let me talk about these taxes. A tax on a good causing a negative externality is called a corrective tax. And corrective taxes are fairly common. We tax smoking heavily, for example. We also tax alcohol. We tax gasoline. All of these are goods associated with negative externalities. They're taxed heavily, specifically to discourage people from consuming the goods. The perfect way to set up a corrective tax is to set the tax equal to the amount of the externality. And this is going to cause consumers to reduce their quantity demanded, in fact, to the level that is socially optimal. Okay? Again, setting the tax exactly equal to the amount of the externality will raise the price enough so that it exactly reduces the demand, or rather quantity demanded, to the socially optimal level. Okay? So if my factory is producing widgets and the widgets are causing $20 of damage to other people, but placing a $20 tax on each widget sold, whether the buyer pays the tax or the producer pays the tax, placing a $20 tax on each widget sold will reduce the quantity demanded to the level that is socially optimal. We can even go a step further with a corrective tax and use that tax revenue to compensate the people who were injured. Remember, in this example, the widgets were causing $20 of damage to other people. The government placed a $20 tax on each widget sold. We could give that tax money back to the people who were hurt, and then the externality has no negative impact on them. They've been compensated exactly for the harm that was caused to them. Okay, let me talk about some private solutions to externalities, ways to reduce the negative externalities or to increase the positive externalities without the involvement of the government. One is to alter or shape social norms. By this, I mean what is considered socially acceptable behavior. For example, we've all been taught not to throw litter out the windows of our cars. However, it's a perfectly rational thing to do. If I'm driving down a road that I will never travel again and there are no police in sight, it's easier for me to throw trash out the window than to keep it in my car and dispose of it properly later on. Yet, I don't do it. I have been taught not to, and that's an example of social norms. We understand that it is unacceptable to litter. Similarly, it's unacceptable to sneeze without covering our mouths. We know it's unacceptable to drive drunk. These are all examples of how people's behaviors have been shifted by kind of what society expects from them, or social norms. A second private solution is to use charities to solve the problems of externalities. There might be a charitable organization that's interested in cleaning up pollution, or a charitable organization that reduces poverty by providing food to poor people. My favorite example of a charity would be a volunteer fire department. About 2/3 of firefighters in the United States are in fact volunteer firefighters. We don't get paid. We have the same training as professional paid firefighters, but just for the most part, outside of densely populated areas, there's not a high enough call frequency to justify having paid people on staff all the time. My fire department is technically separate from any government organizations. It is technically a private, not-for-profit organization that fights fires for the county. The county gives us money to buy equipment and for other things, but we are a private charity completely, providing a public good, fire protection, to benefit the community. Okay. So next, I want to talk about this Coase theorem. The Coase theorem is a neat idea that if we do two things, we assign property rights clearly. So property rights refer to who has the right to do what. For example, when it comes to air, we need to establish whether people have the right to breathe clean air or if producers have the right to pollute the air. So first, we need to make it clear who has the right to do what. Second, we need to allow trades between the two parties. But as long as the property rights are clearly established and trade between the two parties, the injured party and the party causing the externality, as long as trade is possible, then through trades, the two parties will reach a socially optimal outcome. And it's really kind of neat. So think of this example relating to noise pollution. Imagine you live in the dorm or you live in an apartment and you have a neighbor who likes to play loud music. Okay, so this is a source of dispute between you and your neighbor. You like peace and quiet. Your neighbor wants to make noise. The conflict is actually worst when it's not clear who has the right to do what. If it's clearly defined that you have the right to peace and quiet, or that your neighbor has the right to make noise, the Coase theorem says that the two of you can negotiate to come to a mutually agreeable outcome, and that outcome will be socially optimal. Often property rights are assigned by the government or some other higher authority. For example, in your dorm, probably the university has a policy impacting quiet hours or dictating quiet hours. Maybe after 10 o'clock on weeknights, there can be no loud music, no loud noise. That establishes clearly that after 10 o'clock, you have the right to peace and quiet. Presumably, it also implies that before 10 o'clock, your neighbor has the right to play music loudly, at least loudly enough that you can hear it. So that policy establishes property rights. Okay, here's my example. Suppose that you value quietness at $50, but your neighbor likes to play music and values it at $30. Now, what would a benevolent social planner choose to do in this situation? Benevolent social planner would select whichever option, quiet or noise, provides the most benefit to society. In this case, quiet is worth $50, noise is worth $30, so being quiet is socially optimal. The Coase theorem says it doesn't matter how we assign property rights, as long as we do assign property rights, quiet is what the people will select to do. For example, suppose that property rights are assigned so that your neighbor has the right to make noise. This is before quiet hours, and your neighbor has the right to make noise. Well, you really value quiet. You would be willing to pay up to $50 to have quiet. And your neighbor enjoys noise, but not quite as much as you enjoy quiet. Your neighbor, you could go to your neighbor and ask them to be quiet, offer to pay them to stay quiet. And they would be willing to be quiet if you pay them at least $30. So there is, in fact, room for negotiation here. You would be willing to pay up to $50. They would accept anything over $30. So, for example, you could offer to pay $35 for your neighbor to be quiet, and your neighbor would accept that, and what would end up happening is quietness. If the property rights were assigned the other way, and you had the right to quiet, your neighbor still wants to make noise, and so your neighbor is going to think about whether they could pay you for the right to be noisy. Your neighbor would be willing to pay up to $30 for the right to make noise. You, on the other hand, you would require at least $50 to permit them to make noise. So there's no opportunity for trade there. They would not be able to offer enough to get you to sell the rights to peace and quiet. So, end result, quiet happens. So, here's the neat thing about the Coase theorem. If you value quiet more than your neighbor values noise, quiet is socially optimal, and regardless of how we assign property rights initially, after negotiations, quietness is the outcome that will happen. Okay. Now, let's change the example a little bit. Tonight, you still value your peace and quiet at $50, but your neighbor wants to have a loud party. It's your neighbor's birthday, something like that. And tonight, your neighbor values noise at $75. So, what is socially optimal? Think about this from the perspective of a benevolent social planner. The benevolent social planner can choose between quiet, which brings $50 of happiness to society, or noise, which brings $75 of happiness to society. Greater value is noise. So that's what's socially optimal. Okay. How does the Coase theorem work? Suppose that this is during quiet hours, and you are entitled to peace and quiet. Your neighbor would be willing to pay you up to $75 for the right to play loud music. And you enjoy peace and quiet. It's worth $50 to you. So if your neighbor offered you $51 for the right to make noise, you'd permit them to do that. Okay, so you would accept anything over $50. There's an opportunity to trade here. So for example, your neighbor could offer you $60 for the right to make noise, and that's mutually agreeable. It's better for you than quietness, and it's better for them than quietness. Same scenario, but instead your neighbor has the right to be noisy. You would be willing to pay for quietness up to $50. Your neighbor would accept anything over $75 to stay quiet. But there's no room there for negotiation. You would not pay more than $50. They would not accept anything below $75. So there's no potential deal. So no trade's going to happen, and we will end up with a noisy evening. Okay. So in both of these cases, where your neighbor valued noise more than you valued quiet, the two of you, through negotiations, reached an agreement that would permit noise, regardless of who had the initial property rights. And the good thing is, noise is also what's socially optimal. Okay, that was the Coase theorem. Essentially, two people can work it out through trades. There are a couple of limitations to the Coase theorem. One is that in some cases, trades might not be possible. I imagine your dorm has no allowance for people to be noisy if they have their neighbor's permission. In other cases, it might be hard for some of the parties to come together. Like if pollution causes harm to a whole bunch of people in town, it's hard for all those people in town to come together and enter into negotiations with the factory that's causing the pollution. Another solution for externalities is to integrate or combine the two groups. So let's go back to my hypothetical beehives. Suppose I'm considering purchasing some beehives to make honey. The cost of a beehive is $100 and the bees produce $80 of honey for me. If I just think about this on my own, it's not worthwhile. I get $80 of honey, but I have to pay a $100 cost. However, honeybees cause externalities. Those bees fly over from the beehives and land in the neighboring farmer's orchard, and they fertilize the trees. Okay, and so the neighbor gets an extra $50 of fruit from my bees. That's the positive externality. If we think of this from the perspective of a social planner, having bees is a good thing. Bees bring $130 of benefit to society, $80 of honey plus an extra $50 of fruit, and the cost to society is $100. So bees bring more benefit to society than the cost. However, if I'm making a decision on my own, I would not purchase the beehives because the cost of beehives is greater than the private benefit. But if the two businesses were combined into a single business, they would make a decision that turns out to be socially optimal. So suppose that my neighbor and I agree that we're going to merge my honeybees with her orchard. Then when we think about possibly purchasing a beehive that would cost $100, we recognize that the benefit is $80 of honey plus $50 of fruit. The benefit to us is $130, and the cost to us is $100. So we would select to purchase the beehive. Essentially, when we combine our two businesses, integrate the two businesses, there's no longer an externality. There's no longer a third party that is impacted by my decisions. Together, we're the only person in this little economy impacted by the bees. Okay. So that's the end of this discussion on ways of dealing with externalities. The government essentially has two options: control the quantity or tax. As for private solutions, we can establish social norms as to what behavior is acceptable or unacceptable. We can organize private charities to provide public goods or to do activities causing externalities. Third, the Coase theorem says that if we define property rights clearly, then two parties can negotiate and will come to an outcome that is socially optimal. Fourth, integrating the businesses or people who cause the externalities and receive the externalities essentially eliminates the external aspect of it. Once we combine the businesses, the impact is no longer external to my beehive company, but rather it's internal to this joint honey and apple farm.